The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from Alara's bones, the moisture from the soil, and the hope from her heart, leaving only a fine grit that settled in the lines of her face and on the sills of her silent cabin. The prairie stretched out around her small homestead like a judgment, vast and unforgiving, the color of old brass under a sun that offered no comfort, only a bleaching glare. It had been 3 months since Jacob's grave was new, and the land he had loved felt like a cage she had inherited. Every creak of the dry-warped porch boards was a whisper of failure. Every day, the horizon seemed to press closer, threatening to suffocate what little air she had left to breathe. Her crisis had a name: Jedediah Barlow. He had arrived that morning, his bulk filling the doorway, his scent of cheap cigars and entitlement fouling the clean, arid air. He'd held the deed to her debt, a flimsy piece of paper that felt heavier than a tombstone. His words, slick with false sympathy, had coiled around her. An extension he'd offered, but his eyes had roamed over her not as a landowner, but as a predator assessing his claim. The implication was clear: a foul stain on the morning light. He would be back in a week. The deadline was not for payment. It was for her surrender. Now, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, his threat lingered like a fever. She stood clutching the worn fabric of her shawl, a lone figure against the immense, indifferent landscape. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to stand. She was out of money, out of time, and out of fight. The world had abandoned her here, a solitary mourner at the funeral of her own life. That was when she saw him. He was not a part of the landscape she knew. He moved through the twilight like a stray thought, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He was tall and lean, clad in dusty, trail-worn clothes, leading a horse that looked as tired as he did. He stopped at her fence line, the one with 3 posts rotted through, a testament to her neglect. He didn't call out. He simply stood there, his presence a quiet question mark against the fading light. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through the dull ache of her grief. A drifter. The town was full of stories about men like him, men with no past and no name, who brought nothing but trouble. Her hand instinctively went to the door, ready to bolt it, to hide within the flimsy sanctuary of her home. But she didn't move. What more was there to lose? Barlow was coming for everything anyway. He took a few steps forward, his boots scuffing softly in the dust. He stopped a respectful distance away, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek. It held no menace, only a deep and settled weariness. "Saw your fence line, and the roof on that barn looks to be giving way. I'm looking for work. Can mend things. Work for board and $1 a week." Alara stared at him, at the stark silhouette he made against the bruised sky. $1 a week was a fortune she didn't have. Board was a sack of flour and the last of the salted pork. But his offer was not about the money. It was a lifeline, thin and frayed, but a lifeline nonetheless. The town handyman had quoted her a price that had made her sick with shame. The neighbors had offered prayers and pity, but no real help. This stranger, this outcast from the lonely roads, was the first to offer a solution instead of a sermon. The silence stretched between them, thick with the scent of sagebrush and approaching night. She could say no. She could lock her door and wait for Barlow to claim his prize. Or she could take this one desperate gamble. Her own voice, when it came, was thin but steady. "I have flour. And coffee. The bunkhouse leaks, but it's dry." He simply nodded. A slow, deliberate motion. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. In the gathering dark, an agreement had been made. A bargain struck between 2 solitary souls at the edge of the world. His name was Silas. He offered it the next morning over a tin cup of bitter coffee, the single word hanging in the air before dissolving into the quiet industry of his work. He did not speak of where he came from or where he was going. His past was a locked room, and Alara, who was so fiercely guarding the broken pieces of her own, felt no right to ask for the key. Instead, she watched him. She watched his hands, scarred and capable, as they reset the fallen fence posts with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful. He moved with a purpose that her life had lost, each swing of the hammer a declaration against decay. He worked from the first hint of dawn until the last light failed, and he never seemed to tire. He was mending her world, one broken piece at a time. Days bled into a week. He braced the sagging spine of the barn roof, his silhouette a lonely figure against the vast, empty sky. He rehung the gate to the corral so it swung shut with a satisfying click instead of a mournful scrape. He spoke little, and Alara found herself accommodating his silence, their shared meals becoming a ritual of quiet communion. The clink of a fork against a plate was their conversation. A shared glance across the table was their debate. She learned his habits. How he took his coffee black, how he paused at sunset to stare westward. A stillness in him so profound it seemed to pull the light into itself. She learned the language of his actions. When he'd returned one evening from the far pasture with a fat rabbit, skinned and ready for the pot, she understood it was not charity. It was a statement. We will not starve. When he spent an entire afternoon patiently working with the half-wild mare Jacob had never managed to gentle. His voice a low, constant murmur. She saw a tenderness that belied his hard exterior. The whispers from town followed her on her weekly trip for supplies. They called him a ghost, a drifter with bad blood. Old man Hemlock swore he'd seen a wanted poster with Silas's face on it down in the territory. You're a fool, Alara, Hemlock's wife had told her, her voice a sharp prod of condescension. A lone woman taking in a stray like that. You're asking for ruin, but their judgment felt hollow now. What they saw was a phantom, a threat built of their own fears. What she saw was the man who had repaired her fence, saved her barn, and brought food to her table. He had asked for nothing but a roof and a pittance she could barely afford. He treated her with a stoic, almost invisible respect that was more profound than all the town's flowery condolences. Trust was not a decision she made, but a slow, creeping vine that grew in the space his silence created. It was a fragile thing, rooted in shared hardship and the simple, undeniable truth of his steady presence. One evening, she found him sharpening an axe by the light of a lantern, the rhythmic rasp of stone on steel a strangely comforting sound. He looked up as she approached, his eyes catching the light. For a moment, she saw the loneliness in them, a vast prairie that matched her own. And for the first time, she did not feel fear. She felt a kinship. The sky had been a bruised, sullen gray for 2 days, the air thick and heavy with unspoken promises. Then the promise broke. The rain did not fall. It attacked. It came in solid, wind-driven sheets that turned the dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. Thunder cracked overhead like the world splitting apart, and the roar was ceaseless. Alara stood at the window, watching her life dissolve. The dry creek at the edge of her property, a scar on the land for months, was now a raging brown torrent, swelling with every passing second. And it was hungry. It was clawing at the banks of the lower pasture where her small herd of cattle, her last tangible asset, her final connection to the life Jacob had built, huddled together, their bawling lost in the storm's fury. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. She grabbed a heavy oilskin coat and plunged into the deluge, the mud sucking at her boots, the rain blinding her. She was a fool, a tiny, useless figure fighting a god. The water was already calf-deep, its current a malevolent hand pulling her off balance. Suddenly, he was there beside her. Silas emerged from the chaos of the storm not like a man, but like an anchor. He had a rope coiled over his shoulder, his face set in a grim, unreadable mask against the elements. He didn't waste breath on words. He pointed toward the high ground on the other side of the pasture, then to the terrified cattle. The plan was unspoken but perfectly clear. They had to drive them up, away from the rising water. What followed was a desperate, brutal ballet. They fought through the mud and the driving rain, their shouts swallowed by the thunder. Alara slipped and fell, the icy water soaking her to the bone. But a strong hand was there, hauling her back to her feet before despair could claim her. They worked as one body, two parts of a single, stubborn will. They were pushing the last of the terrified animals onto the relative safety of the rise when new shapes appeared through the curtain of rain. 3 riders, their forms menacing and dark. Jedediah Barlow. He reined in his horse, a cruel smirk on his face, his 2 hired men fanning out behind him. "Looks like you're having some trouble, Mrs. Collins," he shouted over the storm, his voice dripping with false concern. "Figured I'd come and help you round up my cattle before they wash away." This was it. He was using the storm as cover, as his excuse to steal everything she had left. The old Alara would have crumpled. She would have wept, pleaded. But something had changed. Standing there, soaked and exhausted, with Silas a solid presence at her side, a different feeling rose within her. It was not courage. It was rage, cold and pure. "They are not your cattle, Barlow," she yelled back, her voice raw but carrying with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And this is not your land. Get off it." Barlow's smirk faltered, replaced by a sneer. He looked past her, at the silent figure of Silas. "And who's this?" "Your new protector." He spat into the mud. "I know his kind. Drifter trash. He won't be here when the law arrives." Silas didn't move. He simply shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. He said nothing. He just watched Barlow, his gaze flat and heavy as stone. In his stillness was a threat more potent than any shout. The town's whispers, the rumors of a violent past that had once made him an object of fear, now became a shield. Barlow, for all his bluster, was a coward. He understood the violence of greed, but he hesitated before the quiet promise of a violence he couldn't control. He looked from Silas's unmoving form to Alara's defiant face and saw not a victim, but a fortress. With a curse, he wrenched his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he snarled, before he and his men retreated back into the storm, defeated not by force, but by the sight of 2 people who refused to break. The storm passed as violently as it had arrived, leaving a world washed clean and trembling. In the pre-dawn light, the air was cool and smelled of wet earth and shattered sage. The creek was a placid stream once more. The cattle were safe on high ground, and the silence was vast and profound. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on Alara's shoulders, but it was a different kind of weariness now. It was the ache of a battle fought, not the hollow fatigue of surrender. Inside the cabin, the small fire in the hearth was a pool of warmth and light in the gloom. It hissed and popped, a tiny, defiant heart beating against the quiet. Silas sat on a low stool, his back to her, stripping off his soaked jacket. A long, shallow gash ran along his forearm, a dark line of red against his mud-caked skin, likely from a flailing hoof or a broken branch. Alara moved without thinking. She fetched the small tin of salve and a strip of clean linen, her movements slow and deliberate in the stillness of the room. She knelt before him, taking his arm gently. He did not pull away. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight as she carefully cleaned the wound. Her touch was steady. The world had been reduced to this small, quiet act. Her hands on his skin, the warmth of the fire, the soft rasp of the cloth. The colossal fight against the storm and the ugliness of Barlow's greed seemed to shrink, leaving only this fragile moment of connection. She finished wrapping the linen, her fingers lingering for a second on his wrist. She looked up, meeting his gaze. In his eyes, she saw the reflection of the flames, and beyond them, a vast, lonely landscape that she recognized as her own. She saw the man the world had thrown away, the man who had inexplicably chosen to stop here, to mend her fences and stand with her in the flood. A thought rose in her, so powerful it had to be spoken, though it came out as barely more than a breath. "You could have any soul," she whispered. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the strength and worth she had witnessed. He could walk away from this broken-down ranch and its broken-down owner. He could find an easier place, a whole person, a life that was not a constant struggle. He could have chosen anyone. Silas paused. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, hiding everything but the intensity of his eyes. The silence in the room deepened, holding the weight of all they had endured together. When he finally spoke, his voice was as quiet as hers, yet it resonated through every part of her being, settling deep in her bones. "I only choose the one who remained." His words were not about geography. He wasn't talking about her staying on the homestead. He was talking about her spirit. He had seen the woman who had lost everything but had refused to be erased. He had watched her stand against the wind, against the town's judgment, against Barlow's avarice, against the fury of the storm itself. He had not chosen a victim to rescue. He had chosen a survivor and equal. A profound understanding passed between them, an unspoken truth that sealed the space their words had opened. He had remained for her, and she had remained for herself. Alara felt a shift deep within her, a fundamental realignment. The grief for Jacob would always be a part of her, a quiet room in her heart. But it was no longer the whole house. She was not the widow waiting for ruin. She was the woman who had stood her ground in the flood. The fire crackled, casting their two shadows on the wall, no longer separate, but merged into one. The future was still a vast, unknown territory, and Barlow would surely return. But for the first time in a long time, the dawn breaking outside the window did not look like a judgment. It looked like a beginning,